There are thresholds in geopolitics that no rational state dares to cross. One of them is attacking a NATO member directly. If Israel were ever to strike a Turkish military unit, intentionally or not, it would trigger a chain reaction that could not be contained um, under Article 5 of the NATO Charter. An attack on one member is treated as an attack on all. That is the red line, one that changes the character of any regional war instantly, from limited conflict to systemic confrontation. When I read reports suggesting Israeli strikes near Turkish-linked assets in Syria, I understood why even rumors of such actions sent shockwaves through defense ministries. Israel has bombed Iranian militias, Hezbollah convoys, and even Syrian air bases with impunity. But Turkey is a different equation. It is not an isolated power. It is the second largest military in NATO with a modernized army, an expanding defense industry, and the political legitimacy of being part of the Western alliance. Israel might win quick tactical engagements, but a war with Turkey would be nation-ending. That is not speculation, it's structural reality. I have studied the Turkish military for decades. It is built for endurance, hundreds of thousands of active troops, armored divisions stationed along its borders, a capable navy in the eastern Mediterranean, and a drone fleet that has transformed battlefields from Libya to the Caucasus. Israel's strength lies in precision, technology, and air dominance. Turkey lies in mass, geography, and depth. If war ever broke out, Israel's limited territory would become its greatest vulnerability. No matter how advanced its Iron Dome or F-35 squadrons may be, no country that small can sustain a prolonged exchange against a major NATO force without collapsing its civilian infrastructure. For years, Israeli intelligence understood this. They maintained cautious diplomacy with Ankara even during crises because they knew the consequences of miscalculation. But under Netanyahu's leadership, that restraint has eroded. Each new strike, each escalation in Syria or Gaza brings Israel closer to the edge of strategic catastrophe. The danger isn't just military, it's political. A clash with Turkey would fracture the Western alliance. The United States could not simultaneously defend Israel's actions and preserve NATO's cohesion. Washington would be forced into a choice it cannot afford to make back its regional client or preserve its global alliance. That alone is a deterrent enough for any rational strategist. Yet rationality in Jerusalem has been replaced by desperation. The Gaza war has pushed Israel to behave as if its survival depends on defiance rather than diplomacy. It is acting like an isolated fortress, striking in all directions, and assuming that American backing will cover every misstep. But that assumption is beginning to weaken. If Israel were to provoke Turkey, it would not be facing another Middle Eastern militia. It would be facing a state with legitimacy, alliances, and the capacity to fight back on equal terms No American administration could justify defending Israel. If that confrontation triggered NATO's collective defense clause, uh, the alliance itself would split. The line between risk and ruin is thinner than most politicians admit. Wars often start with misidentification, a convoy mistaken for an enemy, a radar lock misinterpreted as aggression. In Syria, where Turkish, Russian, Iranian, and Israeli forces all operate within overlapping airspace, one wrong target could ignite a regional conflagration. Turkey has already warned that it would not tolerate Israeli strikes near its positions. If those warnings go unheeded, the next Israeli bomb could detonate not just in Syria, but in the heart of the alliance system that has kept the post-war order intact. That is why this line must never be crossed. Because once it is, there will be no going back, only escalation without control and consequences beyond calculation. Every army fights within the limits of its geography, and Israel's greatest weakness has always been the size of its map. It is a narrow state, less than 50 miles wide at its narrowest point, with most of its population, industry, and command infrastructure clustered along the Mediterranean coast against fragmented militias. That geography is manageable against a state-level adversary like Turkey. It is catastrophic. Turkey commands one of the largest militaries in NATO, roughly 500,000 active troops and a vast reserve force. Its navy dominates the eastern Mediterranean. Its air force operates modernized F-16 seconds, and its drone corps, perfected in the Syrian and Libyan wars, has rewritten the logic of modern air combat. Israel's defense doctrine was built on preemption: strike first, strike fast, and paralyze the enemy before it can respond. That doctrine works against small neighbors and insurgent networks. It does not work against a continental power with deep industrial capacity, redundant supply lines, and territory large enough to absorb blows and strike back. If Israel were ever to enter open conflict with Turkey, it would face an adversary that can fight at scale and in depth. Turkey could mobilize ground forces from multiple directions, Syria, in the Mediterranean, and potentially the Red Sea through naval deployment, while leveraging drone and missile saturation to overwhelm Israeli defenses. Even the Iron Dome, one of the most sophisticated short-range defense systems in the world, would buckle under sustained barrages from multiple vectors. Israel's edge in precision strike would quickly be neutralized by sheer volume. Turkey's defense industry, which produces its own drones, tanks, and missiles, gives it autonomy that few regional powers possess. It does not need American resupply. Israel does. And in a protracted engagement, that difference becomes decisive. No matter how powerful its initial response, Israel cannot sustain a multi-front conflict against a peer-level military. Its logistics, are too narrow, its fuel and ammunition reserves too limited, and its population too concentrated. A single sustained missile campaign could paralyze its economy within weeks. The other dimension is political warfare. Turkey's position as a NATO member would shield it from immediate Western condemnation, while Israel's recent conduct in Gaza has already eroded its moral capital across Europe. Ankara could frame any confrontation as defense of sovereignty or retaliation against aggression language that resonates in Western capitals tired of Israel's impunity. Even if Washington wanted to intervene, it would find itself constrained. To back Israel militarily against a fellow NATO member would destroy the alliance's credibility. To stand aside would expose Israel's vulnerability. Either way, Israel would be strategically isolated, stripped of its diplomatic cover, and exposed to a form of warfare. It cannot fight one that blends conventional strength with legitimacy. That combination is what makes Turkey's position so dangerous for Israel. It is not only a military power, but a political one, capable of rallying international opinion and invoking treaty obligations in its defense. From a purely operational standpoint, Israel's air superiority would give it an edge in the early days. It could strike deep into Turkish-held territory in northern Syria or even attempt to target Turkish infrastructure from the sea. But those attacks would provoke retaliation on a scale unseen in modern Middle Eastern warfare. Turkey's navy could blockade Israeli shipping routes. Its drones could strike military installations from long range, and its missile units deployed across Anatolia could reach critical Israeli infrastructure. Unlike Hamas or Hezbollah, Turkey possesses precision capability and the organizational discipline of a national command structure. It can fight by the book, and that changes everything. In a war of attrition, Israel would exhaust itself first. The longer it fought, the more its strategic depth would shrink, and the more it would rely on an American intervention that might never come. In military terms, the outcome is clear before the first shot is fired. Israel's power lies in deterrence and escalation dominance. Turkey's lies in endurance and legitimacy. One fights for tactical victories, the other for strategic survival. In that equation, Israel cannot win. It could devastate, it could punish, but it cannot prevail. No state, no matter how advanced, can overcome geography, mass, and isolation simultaneously. The illusion of omnipotence that has long defined Israel's security mindset would collapse the moment it faced a true peer competitor, and when that happens, deterrence turns to desperation. And desperation, history shows, is the prelude to defeat. Every alliance is built on a paradox: collective defense works only as long as its members never test it against each other. That is the unspoken rule that keeps NATO intact. But if Israel ever crossed swords with Turkey, that rule would shatter overnight. The very existence of the alliance would be thrown into crisis because NATO's credibility depends on the idea that an attack on one member is an attack on all. Israel's Western backers could no longer pretend neutrality, Washington would face an impossible question. Does the United States defend its indispensable regional client or uphold the Article 5 commitment that anchors its global military order? That is the heart of the NATO dilemma, and it is why every serious strategist in Washington and Brussels fears a Turkish-Israeli confrontation more than any clash with Iran. One wrong move, one Israeli bomb landing on a Turkish unit in Syria or a naval vessel in the Mediterranean, and the alliance could begin to fracture under the weight of its own contradictions. Turkey understands this better than most. Ankara's leaders, from Erdogan to the general staff, know that NATO membership is their ultimate shield, political, not just military. It grants them legitimacy even when relations with the West are strained. Erdogan may be difficult, unpredictable, and defiant, but he still commands the second largest army in the alliance, one that has fought NATO's wars for 70 years. That fact alone forces restraint from both Washington and Tel Aviv. If Turkey declares that one of its units has been attacked, NATO cannot simply ignore it without exposing the hollowness of its collective defense. But if NATO responds on Turkey's behalf, it risks being dragged into a war started by Israel, a non-member acting unilaterally. The alliance was never designed to survive that contradiction. It was built to deter the Soviet Union, not to referee wars between allies and their proxies in the Middle East. In such a scenario, either NATO's unity collapses or its deterrence does. Both outcomes would mark the end of Western cohesion as we know it. For Israel, this reality creates a ceiling on its freedom of action, one it can neither admit nor escape. For years, Israel operated with impunity in the region, bombing Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, even occasionally striking Iranian assets in Iraq or beyond. Each time, it did so under the assumption that Washington's diplomatic shield would neutralize any blowback. But Turkey is not Iran, nor Hezbollah, nor Hamas. It sits inside the Western system. An Israeli strike on Turkish personnel, deliberate or accidental, would force the United States and Europe to choose between two allies. And that choice would not favor Israel. The strategic calculus in Washington is shifting Turkey, despite its friction with NATO partners, remains critical to controlling the Black Sea, containing Russia, and managing Europe's southern flank. Israel, by contrast, has become a liability morally, politically, and strategically. The Gaza campaign has isolated it across global public opinion. If forced to decide, no Western leader would risk the disintegration of NATO for Netanyahu's government. That is the unspoken reality in every intelligence briefing on the subject. This is what makes Turkey's position so powerful and so dangerous for Israel. Ankara doesn't need to fight. It only needs to remind the world that it could. That reminder alone forces every Western capital to re-examine its loyalties. It exposes the asymmetry in Israel's position an isolated state dependent on American largesse, surrounded by nations that increasingly see it as a destabilizing actor. Should Turkey ever invoke NATO language declaring a breach of sovereignty or aggression by Israel, it would trigger a political earthquake in Washington and Brussels. The alliance would have to convene deliberate and reveal publicly where its loyalties truly lie. No amount of lobbying, no media campaign could hide the fracture lines that would follow, and once those cracks appear, they will not close. From a strategist's view, this is the ultimate constraint. Israel's military power stops where Turkey's NATO membership begins. That line defines the limits of escalation, and it is precisely what keeps Israel awake at night. Because behind every sortie, every strike, every operation in Syria or the Eastern Mediterranean lies a question no Israeli government wants to face. What happens if the next bomb hits the wrong target, the wrong soldier, the wrong flag? In that moment, the old order ends, and the West's strongest alliance becomes its greatest vulnerability. Power in the 21st century is no longer measured solely by the size of an army, but by the ability to balance contradictions. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has mastered that art. He condemns Israel's assault on Gaza with righteous fury, calling it genocide before global audiences. Yet behind the rhetoric, he keeps the channels of commerce open, especially in energy. This is not hypocrisy, it is statecraft. Erdogan understands that Turkey's strategic leverage comes from its geography and its economy, not from ideological crusades. He speaks to the Muslim world as its defender while trading with the very nations he criticizes. It's a delicate equilibrium, moral outrage on the podium, pragmatic calculation in the cabinet room. He knows that if Turkey were to confront Israel directly, the costs could overwhelm his already fragile economy. The lira is weak, inflation is relentless, and Turkish industry depends on stability to survive. So Erdogan chooses words over war, at least for now. From a military standpoint, he does not need to fight to assert dominance. Turkey's mere presence in northern Syria, its patrols across the Mediterranean, and its growing influence in the Caucasus have already shifted the regional balance. Israel, by contrast, operates within narrow physical and political limits. Erdogan's restraint is therefore strategic. By not attacking, he keeps Israel and Washington on edge, forcing them to consider the consequences of escalation. The Turkish president knows that his greatest weapon is ambiguity. As long as the possibility of Turkish intervention exists, every Israeli operation must be calibrated against it. That uncertainty alone is deterrent. In warfare, what you might do is often more powerful than what you actually do. The economic layer of this calculation is equally important. Turkey's ambition to become an energy hub for Europe depends in part on Israeli gas. Erdogan wants pipelines running through Anatolia, connecting East Mediterranean resources to European markets. Those projects promise revenue, influence, and international legitimacy, things no war could bring. If Ankara severed ties with Israel completely, it would risk alienating investors, losing leverage in the energy corridor, and jeopardizing its long-term goal of regional primacy. So Erdogan keeps one hand on the sword and the other on the pipeline valve. He positions Turkey as both mediator and potential avenger, a nation that can speak to every side because it belongs to none fully. That posture frustrates Western policymakers but enhances Turkey's autonomy. It's how a middle power becomes indispensable. Still, the tension is real. Erdogan faces a domestic audience that demands action against Israel's war in Gaza. The images of devastation flood Turkish media, fueling nationalist and Islamist anger. His political base expects more than speeches, yet his generals, aware of the risks, counsel restraint. A direct clash with Israel would invite Western retaliation, potential sanctions, and internal economic collapse. For Erdogan, the challenge is to transform outrage into influence, to channel moral capital into geopolitical gain. He has done this before. After the 2010 Mavi Marmara incident, when on Gaza with righteous fury, calling it genocide before global audiences, yet behind the rhetoric, he keeps the channels of commerce open, especially in energy. This is not hypocrisy, it is statecraft. Erdogan understands that Turkey's strategic leverage comes from its geography and its economy, not from ideological crusades. He speaks to the Muslim world as its defender while trading with the very nations he criticizes. It's a delicate equilibrium, moral outrage on the podium, pragmatic calculation in the cabinet room. He knows that if Turkey were to confront Israel directly, the costs could overwhelm his already fragile economy. The lira is weak, inflation is relentless, and Turkish industry depends on stability to survive. So Erdogan chooses words over war, at least for now. From a military standpoint, he does not need to fight to assert dominance. Turkey's mere presence in northern Syria, its patrols across the Mediterranean, and its growing influence in the Caucasus have already shifted the regional balance. Israel, by contrast, operates within narrow physical and political limits. Erdogan's restraint is therefore strategic. By not attacking, he keeps Israel and Washington on edge, forcing them to consider the consequences of escalation. The Turkish president knows that his greatest weapon is ambiguity. As long as the possibility of Turkish intervention exists, every Israeli operation must be calibrated against it. That uncertainty alone is deterrent. Short-term dominance, but long-term estrangement. The regional order that once seemed to revolve around Israel's military superiority has begun to disintegrate under the weight of its own brutality. Even before the current war, Israel's diplomatic reach was shrinking. The Abraham Accords, once celebrated as the cornerstone of normalization with the Arab world, are crumbling under public outrage across the region. Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Amman now walk a tightrope, unwilling to sever relations with Tel Aviv, yet unable to justify them to their own citizens, as images of Gaza's devastation dominate every screen. Every bomb Israel drops erodes not only Palestinian life, but also its regional legitimacy. The cost of occupation is no longer paid only in blood, but in alliances. What has changed most is perception. For decades, Israel succeeded in portraying itself to the West as a democracy surrounded by enemies, a fortress of civilization in a hostile desert. That narrative has collapsed. The Gaza campaign has stripped away the last veneer of moral exceptionalism. European governments, once uniformly aligned with Israel, now face domestic revolts from their own populations demanding accountability. Spain, Norway, and Ireland's recognition of a Palestinian state marks more than a symbolic act. It's the first crack in a wall that once seemed impregnable. The moral consensus that shielded Israel for 70 years is breaking down, and with it, the diplomatic immunity that allowed it to act without consequence. The United States remains its last unconditional defender. Israel cannot sustain a multi-front conflict against a peer-level military. Its logistics are too narrow, its fuel and ammunition reserves too limited, and its population too concentrated. A single sustained missile campaign could paralyze its economy within weeks. The other dimension is political warfare. Turkey's position as a NATO member would shield it from immediate Western condemnation, while Israel's recent conduct in Gaza has already eroded its moral capital across Europe. Ankara could frame any confrontation as defense of sovereignty or retaliation against aggression, language that resonates in Western capitals tired of Israel's impunity. Even if Washington wanted to intervene, it would find itself constrained. To back Israel militarily against a fellow NATO member would destroy the alliance's credibility. To stand aside would expose Israel's vulnerability. Either way, Israel would be strategically isolated, stripped of its diplomatic cover, and exposed to a form of warfare. It cannot fight one that blends conventional strength with legitimacy. That combination is what makes Turkey's position so dangerous for Israel. It is not only a military power, but a political one, capable of rallying international opinion and invoking treaty obligations in its defense. From a purely operational standpoint, Israel's air superiority would give it an edge in the early days. It could strike deep into Turkish-held territory in northern Syria or even attempt to target Turkish infrastructure from the sea. But those attacks would provoke retaliation on a scale unseen in modern Middle Eastern warfare. Turkey's navy could blockade Israeli shipping routes. All three are eroding. The military advantage remains, but it is being challenged by new technologies, particularly the proliferation of drones and precision-guided munitions among non-state and state actors alike. American support persists, but it is politically unsustainable as the moral cost grows, and deterrence, unquestioned, is failing. Hezbollah continues to threaten the north. Hamas has survived repeated assaults, and Turkey has emerged as a state-level counterweight capable of rewriting the regional balance. Isolation, in this sense, is not a diplomatic inconvenience, it is a strategic condition. It limits Israel's maneuverability, erodes its deterrence credibility, and exposes its dependence on external protection. From a military realist view, Israel is approaching the point every dominant power eventually reaches where force no longer buys security. The more it fights, the weaker it becomes, because each operation drains not just resources but legitimacy. The walls that once protected it, NATO cooperation, American funding, regional normalization, are still standing, but hollow. The echoes of support are fading, replaced by warnings. The question facing Israel now is not whether it can survive militarily, it can, but whether it can survive politically in a region and a world that no longer sees it as indispensable. That is the essence of isolation. When the weapons remain sharp, but the world around you begins to move on, every fortress has a cornerstone. And for Israel, that cornerstone has always been the United States without American arms, money, and political cover. Israel could not sustain its wars for a single month. That is not an exaggeration, it is arithmetic. Since 1948, U.S. taxpayers have provided more than $300 billion in military and economic assistance, ensuring Israel's technological edge and diplomatic immunity. Precision bomb, each Iron Dome interceptor, each F-35 sortie over Gaza carries the mark of American industry and approval. This shield has made Israel appear invincible, but it has also bred dependence. No other nation in modern history has enjoyed such unqualified backing, while acting so independently of its benefactors' strategic interests. That imbalance between American protection and Israeli defiance has now become the defining contradiction of U.S. policy in the Middle East. The shield works both ways. It protects Israel from its enemies, but it also protects Washington from confronting the consequences of its own complicity. Every time Israel crosses a line, the U.S. vetoes the UN resolution that would hold it accountable. Every time Israel bombs a hospital or refugee camp, the White House speaks of Israel's right to self-defense, but beneath that rhetoric, fatigue is growing. American officials know they are defending an ally whose actions undermine U.S. credibility in every other theater. When Washington lectures the world about human rights or international law, its words ring hollow against the backdrop of Gaza's devastation. The younger generation of Americans sees this contradiction clearly. Polling shows a dramatic generational divide, while older voters still view Israel through the lens of biblical kinship and Cold War loyalty. Younger voters see an occupying power acting with impunity. That shift in public sentiment is not temporary, it is structural. And once the foundation of moral support erodes, political support eventually follows. From a strategic perspective, this transformation matters more than rhetoric. Israel's entire defense doctrine assumes permanent U.S. support access to American munitions, diplomatic vetoes, and financial stability through guaranteed aid. But the American system itself is changing. The United States no longer commands the same unchallenged global dominance it once did. It faces simultaneous pressures from Russia, China, and internal division. Its capacity to project power indefinitely on behalf of another nation is shrinking. For decades, U.S. leaders justified unconditional aid to Israel as a means of securing Western influence in the Middle East. That logic no longer holds. The Iraq and Afghanistan wars discredited interventionism, and the rise of multipolar powers has shifted the global center of gravity away from Washington. Israel's assumption of eternal American protection now looks less like a strategy and more like addiction, a dependence that blinds both nations to the changing reality around them. In military terms, the shield is already cracking. U.S. ammunition stockpiles, once infinite, are stretched thin by commitments to Ukraine and deterrence in the Pacific. The same precision-guided weapons that Israel relies on are needed elsewhere. Strategically, the White House cannot sustain multiple proxy wars while maintaining global readiness, yet politically, no U.S. president dares cut Israel's lifeline without risking domestic backlash. That's why Washington continues to supply bombs, even as it privately pleads for restraint. But in the long run, dependence without accountability breeds weakness. Israel's assumption that America will always step in is what emboldens its recklessness. And it is that recklessness that now threatens to drag the United States into conflicts. It cannot control the shield, once a symbol of security, has become a trap. As a soldier, I've learned that no defense is impregnable forever. Shields crack, not from a single blow, but from accumulated strain. The American shield protecting Israel is beginning to strain under the weight of moral exhaustion, global competition, and domestic dissent. Washington can delay that reckoning, but it cannot escape it. When the political cost of defending Israel outweighs the strategic benefit, the shield will fall. And when it does, Israel will stand alone in a region it has alienated. That is the trajectory now unfolding. Slowly but inexorably, empires rarely abandon their clients suddenly. They simply grow tired of them. The fatigue has begun, and when America's patience ends, Israel will discover what every dependent power eventually learns. Protection without discipline is illusion, and no shield lasts forever. Every empire believes it is immune to consequence until the moment it isn't. Israel, like the United States, that sustains it, has mistaken military dominance for permanence. Its leaders still act as if superior technology, American patronage, and nuclear deterrence can indefinitely suppress geography, demography, and history, but power built on coercion without legitimacy decays from within. The Gaza war has stripped bare that illusion. It has been shown that a nation can win every battle and still move closer to defeat. The regional map is shifting, and for the first time in decades, Israel is no longer the architect of events, but their reactor. Turkey's reemergence as a great power, Iran's steady endurance, and the Arab world's gradual unification under the moral outrage of Gaza have eroded the pillars of Israeli exceptionalism. The deterrence that once defined Israel's strength now defines its fear, because deterrence without control is panic disguised as power. The danger for Israel lies not in invasion, but in isolation. Its military victories yield no political solutions. Its allies grow weary. Its enemies grow patient. And its deterrence loses credibility the longer it must be demonstrated. The United States, once the unshakable foundation of Israeli security, is showing the same symptoms of overreach that marked every declining empire before. Together, they form a dyad of hubris, one convinced it can rule a region by force, the other convinced it can rule a world by example. Both are wrong. History is not kind to powers that mistake defiance for strategy. Washington's blind defense of Israeli actions has cost it legitimacy across the global South, driving nations toward alternative poles of influence. The same multipolar order that Israel once dismissed as rhetoric is now a reality. Russia and China don't need to fight Israel. They only need to wait while it drains America's credibility. And that process is accelerating for Israel. The existential threat no longer comes from its neighbors. It comes from within its own assumptions. A state cannot survive indefinitely in permanent war. Every generation raised under siege grows harder, narrower, and less capable of imagining peace. Netanyahu's government embodies that condition. Its entire survival depends on escalation. Peace would expose its failures. Yet, the more it escalates, the more it isolates itself, and the more it drags Washington into its orbit of decline. This is how alliances die, not through betrayal, but through exhaustion. America will not abandon Israel out of malice, but out of necessity. The weight of defending the indefensible will simply become too great. When that moment arrives, Israel will face the reality that all unrestrained powers eventually confront. Security achieved through domination is temporary, but enemies created through domination are permanent. From a soldier's perspective, hubris is the deadliest enemy. It blinds nations to their limits, clouds judgment, and turns strength into vulnerability. Israel's leaders have convinced themselves that deterrence equals destiny, but deterrence is only credible if it leads somewhere toward peace, balance, or renewal. When it becomes an end in itself, it corrodes the very security it claims to protect. The same pattern has undone every empire in history. Arrogance replaces prudence, vengeance replaces strategy, and war becomes policy by inertia. That is where Israel now stands, a state at the height of its military power and the depth of its strategic isolation, defended by an ally whose own empire is waning. In the end, The game does not change because of one war or one alliance. It changes because reality reasserts itself. Turkey's rise, the resilience of Iran, and the disillusionment of the Arab world all signal the same truth. The age of unilateral dominance is over. A multipolar order is forming, and in that order, survival will depend not on firepower but on restraint. Israel and the United States still have time to adapt, but not much. If they continue to mistake domination for deterrence, they will share the fate of every power that believed it could defy history. In war, arrogance burns brightest just before it burns out. And from where I stand, that flame is already flickering.